First up, I want to thank the Ministry of Corporate Affairs for a whole host of things. When we speak of the Bankruptcy Code and the IBC in particular, the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code, we normally think of the Reserve Bank, we think of the IBBI, the Bankruptcy Board, we think of perhaps Ministry of Finance, and we believe that their collective efforts has resulted in a process that will probably be revolutionary, that probably will resolve this big burden of bad assets, but that is the immediate short-term gain. The long-term gain is that we will have a faster legal process and a more efficient financial sector. But the one person we ought to be thanking would really be the Ministry of Corporate Affairs, which has been the silent worker behind getting the IBC code in place and, more importantly, ensuring its smooth administration, to direct the National Company Law Tribunals to give as much time as possible to cases that come under the IBC, and to probably educate, apprise, direct the tribunals to respect the timelines that have been put in the IBC. So, ladies and gentlemen, a round of applause to the Ministry of Corporate Affairs. Well, I'm not saying anything new when I say the IBC is definitely a paradigm shift in both the Indian legal system and in the Indian financial system. We've gone through previous avatars of trying to quickly resolve the bad loan problem or just an ordinary debtor problem. The first avatar was in 1993 when we had the DRTs, the Debt Recovery Tribunals. They also had a 180-day timeline, but we know from history that even to register your case, you needed 6 months, because that was the load that the DRTs finally had. And then, of course, the system fell back, even in terms of appointing DRTs and DRATs at the right time. And then exactly 10 years later, in 2003, we had the SARFACI Act. And again, we thought Nirvana is here, and we are going to be able to solve debtor-creditor problems quickly, but that was not to be. The IBC, we have been third time lucky. And it appears now that cases will get resolved in 6 months or in 270 days, as the code has decreed. But there is a distance from here to there. We understand that the first of the cases is about to be resolved by the Hyderabad NCLT, and we may see a few more cases getting resolved in 270 days. Those would be marquee cases. But this is the time that we have to learn what the problems will be. What this session is trying to understand is the role of the insolvency resolution professional. As soon as a company is admitted by the NCLT, they appoint, on the advice of the creditors, an insolvency resolution professional who temporarily acts as the CEO. The board is suspended and replaced by the committee of creditors. Now, what this session is trying to understand is, can that company be run by the new CEO, the IRP, in such a way that the interests of the creditor and the debtor are managed, and finally a resolution is sought. The idea is not to liquidate, but the idea is to run it efficiently and find someone or some process whereby the company becomes healthy. So we are trying to identify whether the interests of the creditor and the debtor can be aligned and whether the company can be made healthy. What are the problems? Well, first up is this new institution of IRP. Will they be able to work with the managements? Let me toss that question first to Nikhil Srivastava of KKR. Nikhil, you, because in your shoes in KKR, you may have seen how insolvency professionals around the world and in India have managed this process so far. Have they been able to win over the loyalty of the existing management and work with them? Is the percentage of success very good?
Thank you, Lata. I would start by taking a step back and looking at the whole process. I think the process is divided into, it's a time-bound process. You have 180 days with a potential extension for 90 days. And therefore it becomes, and at the end of it, if you're not able to come up with a resolution, you liquidate the company, which is not an ideal outcome. So given that it's a time-bound process, the role of an IRP becomes critical, as you outlined. And within that, if you sort of break it up further, the quality of the IRP becomes quite important as well. We are still in early days. It's hard to comment on whether the process has been successful. Again, it'll evolve over time. But as I think of it, the first and foremost, we need to attract the right talent. And in order to attract the right talent, we need to have the right incentives in place. We need to be able to provide them a safe environment to operate, which includes sort of, right now it's unlimited liability, so finding out a way where you can provide protection. And then ultimately, they need to have the skill set to be able to deal with the promoters, more importantly, the management team, which ultimately they need to work with. And at the end of the day, IRP is only a single person, but they'll be working with a team. And that team needs to efficiently sort of take over, not only make sure that the value is preserved through the 180 or 270 days, but then also work with the different stakeholders, which would include the equity, the debt holders, and what have you. And then the other two things I would say is, in order to sort of make that process one where you come up with a solution that maximizes the value for all of the stakeholders, you need to ensure that there is as little information asymmetry as possible, because by doing that, you improve the chances of price discovery. More people show up to the party, and then the creditors have multiple solutions that they can pick and choose from, versus if this were not to happen, then the solution may be suboptimal.
Okay, I mean, these are the requirements from the IRP. I take your point. I had spoken to a couple of companies, bodies corporate, which have acted as, stressed asset funds or stressed asset turnaround companies. And they believe in India, the record of the insolvency professional working with the management is 95% successful. I mean, this is, of course, a couple of companies' view, but getting the loyalty and the cooperation of the existing management, trusting them, is that a very difficult thing, Mr. Bahuguna? You would have, as an ARC, witnessed this process at close quarters. We didn't have an IRP requirement only after the IBC came. They have existed in the past as well. Have they been able to work with companies, the system as it stands?
Frankly, I think it's too early. We are sort of getting over the first, few rounds of it. My sense is that in order to establish what is required for the company, it may well require an approach where you want to seek solutions rather than be wedded to something which is staring you in the face. So the IRP's role is really to facilitate a process in a very transparent manner, to set out the objectives. You will get different interest groups providing solutions which have different components weighed in different amounts. How do you then compare oranges and apples and make it transparent and fair for everyone to participate? Having said that, I think I do believe...
Mr. Bahuguna, I'm sorry to interrupt you. My question is, that is the next stage where he will have to find a buyer or ask the creditors to give a haircut. He has to find a solution. My point is, before that, he is managing a company he doesn't know with a new set of board, which is the creditors. What are the tensions at that time? How does he win cooperation? What has been the international experience since, you have a record with a foreign bank? Is it possible to win over the loyalty of the management, to trust them? The IRP can't run it because he's an outsider. He's a newcomer. He has to trust the management. How does he manage the interest? I mean, because we are starting with, can he manage the interest of the creditor and the debtor, balance both?
I think the answer to that is yes. I see very little divergence in terms of needs of the two groups. If you're looking to do the best by the company and all the stakeholders, then you should be aligned to begin with. Because if it gets the right outcomes, it's surely going to benefit the management and the shareholders and everybody else involved. The question of trust is important, as you mentioned, and it is a time-bound process. So Whether you want to bring teams on top of management, that's left for individual sort of discretion. But I think it should work. I'm quite hopeful it'll work.
Okay. Well, we don't really have a debtor who is in the IBC in our midst. Mr. Gulabchan, I will have to ask you to put on the hat of a debtor and speak for the debtor. If a professional has been appointed, what would you expect him to do? What should be his, his role in achieving, to ensure that the indebted company, by the time he finds a solution, is in ship shape, is working properly?
Well, I can't have an easy answer to that question, but let us go back to, if you see the objective of this particular code is first to see if the company can be put on a sustainable debt basis and find a way to become viable again. Should that not happen, or should it not be agreeable to all the creditors concerned, then it is advised that it will be taken into liquidation. So the first attempt, obviously, intended objective is to save the company and make it functional. Second important thing that we must remember, at the end of the day, people start companies or people start this in order to provide a need in society. And that is why creating a customer is the most important aspect of business. All the players that are there, primarily, other than the debtor, are all players who are financial in nature, who look at only certain returns, only look at certain kind of how they can, somebody wants to buy it because if it goes into liquidation, he will get it cheaper. Everybody has a very different interest, but it's purely financial or making a financial operator. Whereas when you come down to really looking at the possibility of running a company, that it's meant to provide a need of society, whether it is a good or whether it is a service. Now, how do you service that? This is something that, if you notice, most of the IPs that have been looked at or what have been announced so far are all financial people or legal people. Not one of them is somebody from the management side of any company.
Most of them are from the Big Four.
Yeah, the Big
and
Four,
then
yeah.
there are, of course, special situation entities like Alvarez and Marcel who have also appointed their IRPs.
I would like to believe the Big Four know everything and can do everything, but they don't. Fundamentally, most of the companies in the world are not founded by the Big Four. The Big Four provide services to these companies. So it is important to understand that there is such a thing as a customer whom we have to bring in for the survival of the company. At the end of the day, the company's salaries and the debts are paid by the customer, who then gives you work from which you make the money to do all that. So this has to be kept in mind. If you take Chapter 11 of the United States Code, it leaves the management in charge, unless there's a serious default in which the creditors might want to take control. But other than that, it leaves the management in charge. And only when it moves to liquidation that the management moves out. So this is an important aspect that today the IP is in charge and he can't possibly decide.
So 1 minute. I take your point that in the US it's not needed. But we have followed the UK model where we had it over. I want to know, therefore, what would you want as qualifications of the IP?
See, it is important to understand. It's not the question. I'm not quoting this model or that model. We haven't copied just one model. We've taken bits of everything. So fundamentally, there is a reason why they do it. I'm more about the reason why they do it. Because till such time is decided there is going to be liquidation, let the company be managed with oversight, obviously, so that the work of the company and the purpose for which it was created is not defeated. This is a very important feature. It's also a comfort based on which the resolution will depend. At the end of the day, why should a banker agree to take a haircut or reduce something and then finally say, I will continue, simply for the fear of liquidation? You would say so, because now there is a sound way to go forth.
No,
and in the meantime,
I take on board your point, then, and I'll probably toss it over to Mr. Sahu or to Mr. Kotak, that issue, since they were part of when the code was written, on why it was a preference to have an IP rather than have a process where an IP is not there. But that said, since we have to now work with a law which requires an IP, would you want certain qualifications? Would you want them to be only bodies corporate, like it is in Australia, as you were saying?
For larger accounts where it's very small companies of less than 2 crores, 3 crores, maybe an independent person is good enough. But when it comes to large, more complex bodies, I think an institutional IP would do better, because they will develop the healthy practice of providing that need of society to resolve such issues. And I think you will get a much better practice out of it.